Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Gaines. I'm the Dean of the Bren School, and I'm very excited to be able to welcome you here to this event to celebrate the largest gift ever to the Bren School, Environmental Science, in honor of Michael J. Connell. It's a really exciting day, and our event today is going to highlight some of the impact that this spectacular gift will have by showcasing the amazing students who will now have the freedom to tackle even bigger environmental challenges as a result of this incredible gift. But before we go through a series of brief presentations, I want to highlight some key people who were incredibly instrumental in making this gift possible. And this all began with Kim Kimball, who's sitting here in the center. Kim is a member of the Dean's Council and an avid advocate for the Bren School. And he's been an incredible supporter for us in many, many ways. And he thought a couple of years ago that the amazing possibilities of this school might be of interest to Richard Wilson, who's sitting right next to him here in the front, who is one of Kim's legal clients. And Richard, and I read an article recently on Richard that described him as a legendary environmental battler. And you're going to hear his whole story in a few minutes from one of the talks. So I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but Richard was also a trustee of the estate of Michael J. Connell. Now, Michael was born in Ireland in the mid-1800s. He immigrated to the U.S. as a young man, where he was incredibly successful in a number of different kinds of ventures. And he, as a result, was able to get into philanthropy in a very big way, and he had very broad philanthropic interests in arts and education, but he had a real strong personal connection to the environment. And you know, the story of all of this is outlined in the latest issue of Bren News here, if you want to get all of the details. But it's really these personal connections between Kim and Richard that started this off, discussing the possibility of the connection between the legacy of Michael Connell and his environmental interests and the exciting things that happen here at the Bren School. Now, there's one final key player in pulling this whole saga off, and that has been Jennifer Purcell-Deacon here, who is as most of you know, is the assistant dean here for development at the Bren School. And while Richard and Kim were talking about the great fit that this gift might make in terms of the Bren School, Jennifer had a daunting task of actually working the system here on the university administration to make this gift really possible. And so these three people played a really incredible role in pulling this gift off, and it's going to pay amazing dividends in terms of what we can do in this school. So, as I've noted, this gift is an amazing opportunity for our students and for our faculty. And I think it's going to provide some incredible opportunities by giving us the freedom to tackle California's and the globe's great environmental challenges with some innovative new solutions. And we're going to hear about some of these different opportunities that are going to emerge here when we let you hear from some of the students that are going to be supported by this great new program. So before we begin the talks, though, let me also introduce a few other key guests who are here with us today and have also been instrumental in helping make this happen, or are key relatives and friends and co-workers of some of these key people. We have Michael Connell sitting here in the front. This is not Michael J. Connell, who would have been nearly 160 years old at this time. Susan Connell, next to us. Muriel Lavender. Jeff Lobel, another trustee of the foundation. Brock Brower in the end. Ann Brower. And as I've already noted, Kim, Richard, and Jennifer, who have been very instrumental in making this all happen. Now, to give you a sense of the impact of this gift, even though it's only been in place for part of a year, and so the proceeds will grow quite dramatically over time, on the back of the program, you'll see the number of students that have already been supported, both master's and PhD students, as a result of this gift. And you're going to hear them play a prominent role in the program we have put forward for you today. But we're going to start with the Richard Wilson story. And we've asked Professor Tom Dunn to put together a little talk to give you a sense on Richard's contribution to the environment and why he has become such a strong partner with the Brent School.
I think you're going to find out if you take advantage of this event today to get to know Richard a little bit, push yourself to the front and actually get to talk to him. You're going to recognize that Richard Wilson is a kind of living, breathing exemplar of the values that the Brent School seeks to develop and to promulgate. And you'll hear that he's both an innovative thinker and a man of action in the field of natural resources management and conservation. And some of the ideas that he was an early developer and promoter of, in some ways have become, they've entered the lexicon of discussion of natural resource management in California. But I think some of them in particular you'll find are still to be developed, to be completed. And as a result, Richard in a way presents a kind of challenge and an energy to motivate Brent School, particularly students, but even faculty. He was a very early innovative thinker about how to do intelligent, sustainable natural resources management and conservation. In the late 60s, or pre-Earth Day, he was already learning and developing some of the concepts that he came to, or he continues to champion, and I'll give you some examples of in a minute. Now, of course, he's also known, this was referred to in the word battler, I guess, as a man of action in conservation, because he's been a leader of conservation activities, both inside and outside of government, and he continues to do that today in his private citizen role. He seems to have gotten into the field, so to speak, as a result of his being a rancher in the Eel River Valley in Northern California and discovering that his land and the livelihood of his neighbors was threatened by the proposal to build a very large dam near the town of Dos Rios on the coast of California, south of Eureka, and to divert water from the resulting reservoir to a tunnel in south into the Central Valley and Southern California. And that this was on the agenda of state and federal officials. They took it for granted that they could do it, and they hadn't thought out about very well or very thoroughly whether or not it was a good idea in the short or the long term. Now, the story of how Richard then did his homework, motivated first his neighbors and then other allies, and got information out to the media and so on, that sort of whole frenetic story of meetings and lobbying and alliance building and suing or dragging information out of reluctant agencies and having it looked over in detail, all of that is it's a ripping good yarn, and I recommend that you read up about it because it's well documented in a book that some of you may know about already. It's called The River Stops Here by Ted Simon. But I thought that for this audience and maybe for the school and the occasion, it's probably more valuable to concentrate not so much on the adventure story of that particular fight, but on some of the more profound and innovative thinking that the event seems to have triggered in Richard, and how he continued to think about and develop ideas that are as important today and in some cases unresolved today, and that is the challenge to us. And I'll give you just a few examples. One of the things that he recognized early on in the fight, and he continues to develop, is the importance of doing your homework, of really sweating the details and doing thorough technical analysis of natural resources. In the particular example of the dam, for example, he unearthed the fact that the dam site that was proposed was geologically unsound. And many people in the state government knew about it, but they didn't make waves. He exposed it by getting the right people to look at the details. He recruited a former colleague of mine from the University of Washington, a resource economist called Gardner Brown, who is Bob Deacon's PhD advisor, to look at the details of the cost-benefit analysis of the water and the entire scheme, that whether or not appropriate costs and benefits had been assigned to water and lakeside land and all these sorts of things. And what Gardner demonstrated was that the cost-benefit analysis was inept, shallow, and biased. So again, do your homework. Richard had to get the basic data from the agencies, because obviously they probably knew that and they didn't want to give it up. He dragged it out of them and let Gardner analyze it and got useful information. Even today, he's working with a forester in Northern California to analyze the forest dynamics underpinning the deal between the federal government and the Pacific Lumber Company. It was done way back in the Clinton administration, where the federal government ponied up hundreds of millions of dollars to buy out land and logging rights from Pacific Lumber, only to discover that a lot of the value that Pacific Lumber had imputed to the forest resource and that the federal government agencies had accepted were inflated, because much of the forest had already been massively degraded to essentially junk species. Your biologists probably don't like me to say that, but I mean, weed species of trees. I know they're all native and we like them all, but the point is that the agencies had not done their homework. And he and this forester demonstrated the value of doing your homework, getting a better answer, and as a result of that, he eventually, as a private citizen, he sued Pacific Lumber to get some of the money back for the state and the federal government. Okay? So doing your homework is a very important example that he demonstrates. Another idea, I think, that he came to very early, and a lot of us pay lip service to it, but we're still working on what it means and how to do it. He sensed very early that the value of the resource to be managed and to be conserved was not just the easily identifiable components of the resource, like board feet of timber or acre feet of water, the things that you can easily quantify and add up, but that there was innate value in all the complicated interactions that go on in the forested landscape. All the overlapping interacting layers of trophic levels and the interaction between the organics of the forest and the inorganics of the soil and the hill slopes, and the soil, hill slopes, and forest, and the quality of the river, and the quality of the river and its productivity for fish. And that the intricacy and the diversity of those functions had value all of their own. And that before you should go in and create massive disruptions of them, or make momentous decisions about investments that could yield disruptions, you should figure out the value of those interactions and that complexity and that diversity. Now, as I say, the remarkable thing about Richard was how early he sensed that. But, his promulgation of the idea is a continuing challenge, because I think we're still having difficulty resolving what to do in the face of that complicated problem. We all kind of recognize it, but we are not yet making concrete progress on doing some of the things that he challenges us to do. A third early idea of his was, what we now call sustainability. When he was, after his first career, so to speak, as a rancher, he became director of the California Department of Forestry, and he was a proponent of sustained yield planning in the management and exploitation of forests. He wasn't saying you should lock up the forest. You have to use the forest, but you use the forest in a manner that's sustainable in the long term. And so he wrote into the California Forest Practices Act, I think it was 1994, a requirement for sustained yield plans with a 100-year timescale. And also he promulgated the idea of trying to predict the cumulative effects of land use practices, including cumulative watershed effects, so that you could anticipate, before you commit yourself to large-scale, potentially destructive policies, what the consequences are likely to be. Now, that's a very profound, challenging, if difficult thing to do. He was a very early proponent of it. Now, of course, the agencies and the large companies are not wild about doing this because A, it's hard, and B, it might limit some of their activities. But the gauntlet is thrown down for us to pick up. And I'd say this last example I'll give is that he sensed very early on the importance of looking at natural resources in the context of human communities, that you were not likely to be able to lock up every piece of landscape in its natural condition. You had to find a way of utilizing them in a sustainable, non-destructive way so that they could sustain vibrant communities. But if you utilize the resource in a way that rapidly degrades it, leads to divisions amongst various interest groups within communities, and ultimately impoverishes the community, then you lose not only the communities and the rural economy, but you lose the resource and all the things you value in it, the fish and the wildlife and so on. So there's 4 examples, and I promise you I could give you more, but I've done enough lecturing in this room for today. Some of the students who already heard me this morning, they're already going, again? Is this on the midterm? All I will say is I recommend that you get to know Richard, both personally, find out about his kind of coherent philosophy of how to manage and conserve natural resources in a sustainable manner, what it's going to take. Right? So I will just say, first of all, to Richard, thank you very much for the immediate gift you've given us today by facilitating this gift, but also for the gift of your example. It's both informative and energizing, and we value it greatly. Thank you.
Now we want to have some presentations by 4 of the 11 students who are the original Michael J. Connell Fellows. And we're going to start with 2 talks by PhD students, and our first presenter will be Matt Kay.
One of the lessons from forestry, from where protected areas were put in place in forest ecosystems, is that you don't need to be a card-carrying forest ecologist to tell that there are differences inside and outside of these areas that are closed to resource extraction. This is actually an aerial photograph of a clear cut in the headwaters forest, and Professor Dunn alluded to this, and this Mr. Wilson's contributions to protecting this piece of forest is characterized in an article in this month's issue of San Francisco Magazine, just in case you were wondering about his current activity levels. And one of the kind of characterized effects of protection in sort of 2 broad categories. The first are effects inside of borders, and one of the effects is protection of species that don't really exist outside of the borders, okay? And There are many others, as Professor Dunn alluded to, okay, and this just we don't actually believe in Bigfoot here. It's just a joke. And the other suite of effects, as Professor Dunn alluded to, are effects that come outside of the borders, effects that are essentially exported. And one of the big ones is clean water, because forests stabilize sediment, and clean water flows from these forests where they might otherwise experience sedimentation and for use in municipalities, and also, as Professor Dunn alluded to, we obviously didn't coordinate our talks, utilized by fish in habitat that isn't silted in. And these sort of dynamics, when you consider the scale of human landscape interactions in a working landscape, this is the border of the Olympic National Park up on the Olympic Peninsula. The importance of these sort of interactions and effects both within and the effects that get exported out of these closed areas, they become very apparent, and the need for these sort of protected areas is very clear. And so with the development of marine protected areas and the theory behind why these might be beneficial for resource management in the ocean, we sort of think along the same lines as we'd have in forestry, which is there are benefits inside borders where fishing is prohibited, and there are clear benefits outside of borders. And the primary benefit inside, right, is you get an accumulation in the number and size of species of fish, okay? And what I'll talk about today is that some of these adult animals diffuse across borders in a process known as spillover, such that stakeholders, is this the laser? There it is. The stakeholder I'm blinding then has access to larger fish that potentially might increase yield outside the borders. The species I study is the California spiny lobster, and it's a clawless species of lobster, lives on the bottom of the ocean in association with rocky habitat. It's distributed from Point Conception, just north of us here, or actually west, down to about the middle of Baja, California. And it forms the basis of a vigorous fishery. These are traps. This is what our harbor looks like about 2 days before the opening of lobster season, where different fishermen have different colored buoys and stack their gear to ready it to load onto vessels, which then take them out to the fishing grounds, and then they're individually deployed onto the seafloor and recovered, and animals are removed. And so there's very much of an interaction here with stakeholders and landscape, in this case a seascape. And so the seascape where I conduct my research, as I mentioned, is at our Channel Islands. And what I did is to work with commercial fishermen to go out to these areas, and everywhere where there's a yellow dot, I worked with commercial fishermen to deploy research traps, basically lobster traps, and so to investigate some of the theoretical predictions about what might be happening inside and outside of reserves. And remember, the whole marine reserve movement, not only in California, but across the globe, is relatively young, especially compared to the terrestrial application of closed areas. So we're just sort of empirically discovering what the impacts of these areas are. And so what we found, working with fishermen, is that inside of a closed area, we have many more lobsters per trap than in sites outside, okay? So that's the reserve effect inside. And also, we have effects outside, and it's kind of subtle in this figure. This is the last data slide I'll show, so stay with me, but the slope of this effect, how we have relatively fewer lobsters here right next to this border and relatively more inside, that's a signature that spillover is happening. And that as these lobsters move around, those near the border are more likely to cross the border and be captured. And so what we're thinking is happening here is that, yes, there's a strong conservation effect of these closed areas, but they're also supplementing fisheries yield through the spillover, the export of adults into the fished areas. But the research program is much more than marine reserves. We're also studying the growth and movement and habitat associations of these lobsters. I don't have time to go into it today. We're also doing management relevant science, and this is very important to Mr. Wilson, working with trying to figure out what sustainable rates of removal are, working with managers to once those are identified, implement sort of reasonable tax or rates of removal. And then what I think is perhaps the most important part of my work is roping stakeholders into this entire process. And Professor Dunn alluded to that, and he discussed Richard Wilson's ability to engage stakeholders and residents of Round Valleys in opposing the dam at Dos Rios. And I really think that stakeholder involvement is critical for a couple reasons. First of all, they have skills to do difficult work. I can't deploy lobster traps. I can't fish like a lobsterman, but they can. Undoubtedly, Mr. Wilson engaged individuals who had skills that he didn't, and they worked together and achieved results that otherwise he wouldn't have been able to do alone. And then secondly, when we engage stakeholders, and I've seen this, I'm going to give an example shortly, it really helps with the buy-in to the science that's happening. And when we're trying to do science, like in this school, where we're trying to achieve some result or influence management or human behavior, oftentimes good science just isn't good enough. It's not enough to generate the information. Information has to penetrate to stakeholders and to decision makers and to resource users so that they understand and trust the basis of decisions. And I have an example of that. This is a fisherman that I work very closely with, Sam Shrout, and I'm going to describe an evolution of his perspective of working with me and doing science, and is in no way intended to belittle him. He's one of my favorite humans on the planet, and he's extremely bright. But when I first approached him about working with me collaboratively to work in these protected areas, his off-the-cuff response was, "Marine research, eh? No doubt, so you can further restrict our fishery." And his tongue was in his cheek, and but this was, in every jest is a truth, right? So, oops, wrong button. There we go. So when we started going out inside these reserves, what we saw was that the number of lobsters in traps was much greater than lobsters outside of traps, okay? So early on in the process, there was a little bit of mistrust. We went out and we started fishing these areas, and in the first week or so we were working together. His take on what this difference was, well, that clearly demonstrates we took a great fishing spot and put it in a reserve. Okay, you've proven that, congratulations. Do you get a PhD for that, right? So, but as we continued to work together and trap after trap after trap in these closed areas came up, he started to connect the dots and the relationship between the amount of fishing effort and the resource yield that one might expect. And a big hot button issue in our lobster fishery right now is, what is sort of the optimum amount of effort to optimize economic and fishery yield? And the conclusion he came to is that, well, if we could, the lobster fishermen amongst ourselves could agree to reducing effort, I'd be willing to do it at my island. He fishes at Santa Rosa Island. So by getting him out on the water and demonstrating the impact of the extraction and the relationship to effort, it plants a seed in his mind, and now he's I wouldn't say a leader, but he's hosting discussions with other fishermen about this sort of dynamic, and this sort of change might be coming to the fleet, and this is going to accelerate it and inform it. And when I was doing a little bit of research on Mr. Wilson, I had to laugh as I was reading this book. By the way, The River Stops Here is a fantastic book. Everybody in this room should read it. And the gentleman here that does not look like Ronald Reagan is a guy named Elmer Bauer, and he was a resident in Round Valley. And Mr. Wilson approached Elmer Bauer, I think 1967, I'm not sure on the year, and he said, look, there's this plan to flood our valley, and if we don't get in front of this thing, it's going to happen, and we're going to be out of house and home. And I don't know why, but I think it had to do, wheat was down, and maybe there's a ruffian boy next door chasing his daughter or something, but Elmer's response was, as far as I'm concerned, they can have it. For him, it was a way out at that point. But with continued persuasion that ultimately won the day, Elmer Bauer became a really strong ally for sparing this valley. And ultimately, one of those examples is that he worked very closely with Mr. Wilson, and ultimately held a meeting in Covelo, which is sort of the center of that valley, or the population center, and got over 500 other stakeholders to sign on in opposition to this dam. So just like the fishermen with whom I worked, he went from a position of skepticism and pessimism to one of activism and getting a really strong result. And so it just sort of, there's that very fun parallel for me to see the value of stakeholder involvement in these sort of environmental missions. And then I'd just like to conclude by thanking the Connell family and Mr. Wilson for this tremendous gift. But as Professor Dunn also alluded, they come to us as much more than benefactors or bearing this gift. And the legacy of Mr. Wilson is tremendous. And it's thank you ... because I sincerely hope for continued interaction with Mr. Wilson because of the lessons he has to offer. And it's over, so this is, late 60s with then Governor Reagan, and this is more recently in the headwaters. And so we're talking about over 5 decades worth of activism and achieving results and forward thinking. And so he comes to the Bren School as much more than a benefactor, but as more of a mentor. And I think we all really look forward to that relationship. So thank you.
Great job, Matt. And our next speaker is Annie Yao.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And thank you, Matt, for that talk. My name is Annie. I'm a PhD student here at the Bren School. And I just want to say it is an honor today to be able to share my research in a little bit more detail with Richard Wilson and then with family and friends of Michael J. Connell. So I'm going to talk about my work. I work on giant clams. And so when I came to the Bren School years ago, I came from a general biology background, and I just came knowing that I wanted to use science to solve environmental problems. And so that's why I came to the Bren School. So today, most of my work focuses on population ecology. And population ecology is a great discipline for solving environmental problems, because if you think about whether you want to save some rainforest trees, or whether you want to manage a tuna fleet, or whether you want to conserve the population of mountain gorillas, you're ultimately interested in how many individuals there are remaining and how quickly they are growing or declining, and why. And so this is the essence of population ecology, the study of animals at the population level. So I study population ecology, and I'm going to bring you for a moment to the place of my dissertation research in French Polynesia. So there's a chain of islands in French Polynesia called the Society Islands. You're probably very familiar with Tahiti and Bora Bora. You've probably heard those names before. And I work on 2 other islands within this chain. One is Moorea, this one you see here, and Tetiaroa, the small one above it. So this is where I work, so I'll bring you there for the moment. Imagine you are there. Okay, so I studied the population dynamics of giant clams on these islands. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about why this is important and why it's a good exemplary study. Okay, so I'll start first with giant clams. Giant clams are the world's largest living bivalve. The largest species can grow up to 1.5 meters long, so pretty big, and it can weigh up to 550 pounds. So these are massive animals, okay? And they're pretty unique among bivalves in that they form a symbiotic relationship with photosynthesizing algae. And so they sit on the seafloor, and they have this tissue exposed, and within their tissue, you will find millions of photosynthesizing algae. And the algae soak up the light, photosynthesize, and then they give a little bit of their nutrient excess to the giant clam, and the giant clam in turn provides a safe, brightly lit home for the algae. So this is a unique symbiotic relationship among bivalves. So they're unique in that aspect. And giant clams also exist on coral reefs worldwide. So they exist all over the globe. There are giant clam populations all over the globe. Most importantly, though, giant clams are disappearing from certain islands. And so this is really important, and they are disappearing because of us. Humans are harvesting them. We are harvesting them. We are removing them from the oceans for food, for their shells, and to sell in the aquarium trade. And so it's impossible to study the population dynamics of giant clams without incorporating this human aspect. You know, you can't study the environment without also studying humans. We are making the biggest impact on giant clam populations. It's not anything else in nature. It is human harvest that is impacting giant clams and causing them to disappear. So here are some photos of people harvesting giant clams. So in French Polynesia, where I work, in the Society Islands, when people harvest giant clams, it's mostly just for food. It's not for any other reason. They're mostly harvesting it and eating it themselves or selling it locally. So in French Polynesia, it's really what's known as a small-scale fishery. So there's not extensive, fishing fleets and that sort of thing. It's a couple of people going out in their boats or going out in their canoes or just swimming straight out from the shore and collecting clams one by one by hand. So it's a small-scale fishery. But small-scale fisheries feed millions of people worldwide, mostly in Asia and the Pacific. So many people in Asia and the Pacific, especially in developing countries, get most of their protein from small-scale fisheries. They go out and they gather protein sources from the ocean. So small-scale fisheries are vastly important to these people, but they're very rarely studied. And it's because they occur often in developing countries and they are not commercially important, right? They're like local markets. They're collected and immediately consumed or sold locally. And so on a national and international level, they're rarely important enough for scientists to want to invest time into studying these small-scale fisheries. Okay? So on the island of Moorea, which is my main study site, the giant clams there, the largest ones, have already been harvested. So on Moorea, giant clams are no longer giants. They're all pretty small still. They're all pretty small now. And there's a pattern of overharvest in this island chain. So the next island over, Tahiti, is the most highly populated island. And they've already, for the most part, eaten all of their giant clams. And now they are starting to go to Moorea, the next island over, to harvest and eat giant clams. So there is a pattern of overharvesting and moving on to the next island. And so my question is, can we learn enough about giant clams that we can come up with management strategies that can stop this pattern of overharvest so that people can continue harvesting but in a sustainable manner? So in order to study the population ecology of this giant clam, I am using a population model. So there's a lot of math involved. The model comes mostly, it actually originates in studying plant populations, but we can apply it to many different species. We just need to tweak it so that the biology is appropriate. And so the concept behind it is pretty simple. You measure how fast individuals are growing and their likelihood of survival and how fast they are reproducing. And then you take the model and you specify those things. The model will then take hundreds and thousands of individuals and sort of multiply them through time using what you've specified. So the model will then tell you in the future how many individuals there are based on these real-world measurements that you've entered into it. Okay? So it's pretty basic. So what I've done for the past 5 years in French Polynesia is a few things. First, I've tagged thousands of clams, and I've measured their growth and their survival and their reproduction for the population model. So here you can see a photo of a small clam. He's a little closed up, and one of my tags. They all get a little unique tag. So I've marked and measured thousands of these for years. So I have a time series of how the population is doing. I've talked to fishermen, and I use fishermen generally as a broad term for anyone who harvests resources from the ocean. So I've talked to people who harvest giant clams. It might be hard to see, but there's a water bottle cut in half that serves as a good container for holding giant clam meat. And then I've also measured their catch directly. So how many giant clams does each person take, how often, and how large are they? So I've done these things for years, and this is all going into the population model. And so using this population model, I intend to analyze the model to learn about the population. How fast is it growing? Is it growing or declining? What is the impact that fishing is having on the giant clam population numbers? And to determine whether there are bottlenecks to population growth that we can manage to increase, and whether there are sustainable management strategies for this giant clam, given its biology. And so prior to this study, nobody had any knowledge about giant clam population processes, so how fast they were growing or declining. So the findings from the study will be very new for science in general. And so in the coming months, what I intend to do is to analyze the population model and to really determine what are some appropriate management strategies for giant clams. So What happens to the population if we implement marine reserves? Does the population grow or does it decline? Is it better maybe instead of marine reserves to apply some sort of size limit where you let all the clams reproduce for a few years before you harvest them? Does that encourage population growth more so than marine reserves? Okay? So that's, in the coming months, I intend to analyze the population model. And without the support of the Michael J. Connell Trust, I would not be able to complete this next step of my dissertation. And so I'd like to thank them for that. It is a significant contribution to my dissertation, and it allows me to complete this section of my research and to do so in a timely manner and let me finish my degree. So I'd like to thank, again, Richard Wilson, and then all of the family and friends of Michael J. Connell for your contribution to the Bren School. And that's it.
Okay, now we're going to shift from the PhD students to two of our master's students. And we're going to start with Yemi Adeleye, who is going to tell us about what this gift is going to allow him to do as a master's student.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Yemi Adeleye. If I were in Nigeria, I would say my name is Yemi Adeleye, but I've been in the US for about a year, and I'm kind of changing the way I call my name myself. So, to give you a little background, I'm from Nigeria, the sixth largest producer of petroleum in the world, sixth largest producer of petroleum in OPEC, and yeah, the entire country depends on petroleum, but some people pay the price, not just in terms of losing their resources, but also in terms of losing their livelihood, in terms of losing their, houses, their jobs, and all. I have a little write-up to talk about what this fellowship would do for me, and I hope I'm able to look up while trying to read. I don't have a presentation, so because I'm not talking about a research. Basically, growing up in the countryside was so much fun for me than my later life in the urban cities. We had fresh air, we had pristine water bodies, which had a lot of aquatic animals, and at times we were always tempted to even drink directly from the river without processing it. We barely needed air condition at night, and we worried very little about air and water pollution. But the story has all changed today, and no thanks to the discovery of the black gold in Africa, and that's why I call petroleum. And over time, the exploration continued, and there was a lot of pollution attached to that. And as I concluded my undergraduate degree, by the way, I studied microbiology back home in Nigeria. As I concluded my undergraduate degree in 2006, I began to ask myself a couple of questions. I will tell you some of them today. The first is, can everything be green again? Because pollution kills everything standing. Can the water be pristine again? Can the local farmers and the local fishermen be employed again? Can people speak to the government and the petroleum industry about the impact of unsustainably exploring petroleum? By the way, Nigeria can't stop exploring petroleum because that's what the economy depends on. But I believe it could be done in a proper way where we have the money and we don't kill the environment just because of it. So I asked myself, can I personally become one of those voices on this side of the world, because we don't have so many people speaking over there? Can I be one of those voices that speak for the environment and for the future generation? Can I go beyond speaking to actually being a problem solver? Because you have to also have some ways to solve the problem and not just talking about them. Even though the pollution is a local problem, the deltas of the southern Nigeria drain into the world water body through the Atlantic Ocean, and it drains with all the pollution in it. So it's, though a local problem, it's affecting the entire world in a way. Well, I didn't know I was going to be a problem solver, but I had a dream to be one of them. And I hope to become one of the environmental managers of the country someday. I had a dream to be part of the remediation of what was, or what is, because it still continues, the pollution of the petroleum industry. Basically, it affects the watershed of the country, and the particular area where the oil comes from is called the Niger Delta, and the Niger Delta happens to be the largest wetland in Africa and the third largest drainage basin in Africa. I had a dream that I would be trained in one of the best programs for environmental, problem solving, and I'm happy I'm in the Brent School. Gradually, the dream started coming to reality when I gained admission in 2009, and I resumed study here in the Brent School, and I started taking courses that were opening my eyes to the possibility of correcting the problems and finding economic ways of getting resources without messing up the world. But at a point, it would have been impossible to finally achieve the dream because of, several restraints, and one of them being financial restraints. And the dream I've experienced a complete stall, but for the Michael J. Connell Memorial Fellowship, which I received. And I want to say to Richard Wilson and the entire Michael J. Connell family, one of those dreams you've helped to come to reality through the donation to the Brent School. And I want to say thank you very much. I also want to appreciate the members of staff of the Brent School and the faculty who are training me to not just be a graduate, but be a good problem solver for my community and for, as far as I can go. We are here today to dedicate the Courtyard to the memory of Michael J. Connell, but I want to say on a final note that we are not probably just dedicating the Courtyard, we're also dedicating our future achievements as environmental problem solvers in different parts of the world, be it in North America, be it in Europe, or back home where I came from in Africa. And I want to say thank you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Yemi, for those really inspiring words. Yeah, I know your dreams are going to come through. And so our last speaker is also a master's student, and this is Mimi Suhu.
And I'm really so happy to be here. 5 weeks in, I can't tell you how many times I've been completely blown away by the sheer breadth of experience and interest of people here. And I'm really grateful and very much humbled to be here among you all. And I recently graduated from UCLA with a degree in geography and minors in English literature and GIS, and with a strong sense of the importance of water and soil conservation and recognizing the issues surrounding agriculture and land use and water, especially in California, I came to Brent intent on studying pollution prevention and remediation with respect to our nation's watersheds. I grew up in a small town called Alameda, which is in the Bay Area. It's essentially an island connected to Oakland, encompassed by water. And growing up there, I didn't really have a strong notion of the immediacy surrounding water issues until I came here to Southern California, where I've been living for the past 5 years, and where I came to know how precious a resource water is and how integral it is to so many processes that interest us as scientists and policymakers. Water is essential both as a medium and an indicator of ecological health within and across incredibly complex systems. And what's fascinating about those systems is that they're so closely linked and interact with one another. And my interests are in studying the effects that heavy industry and agriculture have on local water resources and consequently on public health. In 1962, Rachel Carson helped launch the environmental movement and facilitated the ban on DDT with her book Silent Spring. But since then, there are so many chemicals that have been released and transported into the environment that haven't been adequately regulated or assessed for their health risks. And as water is such a pressing and polarizing issue within California, as citizens, we can't emphasize enough the need for science or management-specific and policy-specific science. And so coming to Brent and utilizing its incredible resources, I hope to, and I believe I will someday, contribute as an environmental professional capable of communicating the complexity of these issues and contribute and translate those into real change, not only for the sake of our nation's waterways and the rich ecosystems that sustain them, but also for the sake of human health. And so with that said, I'd like to thank Mr. Wilson again, not only for his belief in us as this next generation of environmental leaders, but also for serving as such an incredible role model to all of us to look up to. So with that, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mimi. Well, that's the end of the formal presentations here. I think you can see how we view this gift as an amazing investment, and this is just a taste of the kinds of seeds that are planted by this kind of an investment at a school like the Brent School, and hope that you enjoyed the presentations. Please join us now outside for for refreshments and the unveiling of the naming of the courtyard in honor of Michael J. Connell.